You know, every once in a while I come across something that's so absurd, it somehow manages to be pretty damn cool. Something so ridiculous, it somehow manages to be quite awesome. And that's exactly what I'm going to be looking at today. Today I'm going to be taking a look at a retro emulation digital picture frame. You heard that right. This thing is a retro emulation picture frame. It's made by AIS LPC. I'm pretty sure that's an acronym, because if it's meant to be a name, I sure as hell ain't gonna try to pronounce it. It retails for about $100 and alleges to have over 15,000 retro games included. Does it in fact have 15,000 retro games? And is it in fact any good? God, I can't believe I'm reviewing a picture frame. Let's find out. Inside the box, you have the digital picture frame itself, an included cable and power brick for the power supply, a stand. You can actually mount this thing vertically, horizontally, or you can even mount it on a wall, and these two heavily inspired by PlayStation gamepads, as well as this 64GB SD card, which is where I assume the 15,000 retro games are stored. Taking a closer look at the included controllers, they feel extremely light, extremely plasticky, and pretty cheap. They remind me a lot of the gamepads that were included with the M8 4K game stick that seems to be pretty popular that I reviewed a while back. I really believe these are the exact same controllers, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, because although those controllers were really cheap, they actually perform surprisingly solid for most games. The button layout is exactly what you would see on a PlayStation 2 controller, including L3 and R3 clickable joysticks. These are not Bluetooth controllers. They need the included dongle in order to function, and they each require two AAA batteries. Over on the back of the frame is where you'll find the port for the power supply, a USB Type-C port, a USB-A port, a 3.5mm headphone jack, and an SD card slot. Under the hood, I have no idea what chipset it's running. I opened mine up to take a closer look, and the chip only had the number 4 on it. I know for a fact the chip is of ARM architecture, but I have no idea what it is. Is it M4, R4, X4? It just has the number 4 on it. If anyone knows for certain what chipset this thing is running, let us all know in the comment section. And I know for a fact it has a Mali G31 inside, so I actually expect it to give some pretty solid performance. Booting it up without the SD card inserted takes you into the standard picture frame mode. It's one of those Framio Android Power picture frames, so in that regard, it's actually pretty cool. You install an app and have an access key, and anyone with your access key can just drop pictures that will display on the frame. So it's kind of cool to have in your living room or office and have family and friends just drop random pictures throughout the day. With the SD card inserted, it powers up into battle time mode, and we're greeted to an EMU Elect loading screen, which was a pleasant surprise knowing that this thing is running a version of EMU Elect. Once fully booted, I was greeted to an even bigger pleasant surprise to see that Dreamcast, PSP, Nintendo DS, and N64 all had libraries on this thing. It has games from the NES to the PSP and almost everything in between. So right from the jump, I had to try Dreamcast emulation. In my brain, there was just no conceivable way that this thing could run Dreamcast well. And while you will encounter some hiccups and some periods of slowdown, most of the included Dreamcast games are playable. You can tell they definitely scaled down the graphical settings so that it can run more optimally. And this display doesn't really do it any favors as well. Nonetheless, the fact that Dreamcast was playable to this capacity was very impressive. Switching over to PSP, it was very similar to Dreamcast. Most of the lower resource demanding games ran pretty smooth, but some of the more beefy stuff, and there's not many on here, some major periods of slowdown, and some graphical hiccups along the way. Definitely not the best way to emulate PSP, but the fact that I'm even talking about PSP being emulated on a picture frame is absolutely insane. Moving on to N64, the performance was surprisingly fair, but definitely not perfect. It has a very impressive N64 library, and the games run smooth for the most part, but you will notice some graphical hiccups and some screen artifacts while playing certain games. While DS doesn't have as beefy of a library as the N64 does on here, the performance was decent. Probably the biggest obstacle you're going to face is how to comfortably orient the screen depending on which game you're playing, and this can be easily accomplished using the shoulder buttons on the controller. It was at this point that I have to say this thing actually started to win me over. PS1 had a really nice lineup of games and all of them ran well, which at this point I was expecting as much. If it can run Dreamcast and PSP the way that it does, I knew it wasn't going to have any problems running PS1. awesome. Now where I feel this thing really shines is while playing the 16-bit and arcade classics. The 16-bit libraries are pretty massive. I don't believe it's a complete set, but it's pretty damn close to it. And the performance is just really clean. Whether you grew up an SNES kid or a Sega Genesis kid, you're gonna find stuff you like on here. And as far as arcade games go, there's a ton of our favorite beat 'em ups, shoot 'em ups, and fighting games. This is the area where it's its strongest, and it accomplishes it really, really well. So the Retro Emulation Picture Frame. Guys, I have to say, this thing is actually pretty badass. But the only problem is, who the hell needs a Retro Emulation Picture Frame when there's a gazillion Retro Emulation handhelds on the market? Personally, I think this is a great thing to have in the office. Or it'll make a great gift for grandma or one of those elderly relatives that you dread having to go visit. It'd be a nice sneaky way to have a game console there and pass the time while you're visiting. Not to mention, I'm sure they'll appreciate getting random photos of you and the family dropped in on them. I don't know, I think it's pretty cool, and I appreciate the fact that they actually tried and they didn't just slap something together with a bunch of underperforming NES games and a bunch of knockoff ROM hacks. I feel it's only two major drawbacks. One is the fact that it doesn't have a built-in rechargeable battery. I feel like they really missed the golden opportunity to make a tabletop retro emulation console that you could take with you on the go by forcing you to have this thing plugged in at all times. And two, it would have been nice to have HDMI output so you could play these games on a bigger screen if you wanted to. Other than that, it's a neat little machine with a major identity crisis. If you guys are interested in the Retro Emulation Picture Frame, I'll have links in the description below. Until next time, this is Ness, signing out.